welcome to a Key Smash Studios tutorial. This is part 5 of our advanced rollerball series. If you haven't watched the previous parts, I will link them in the description below, along with Unity's rollerball tutorial, as the end of that series is the beginning of ours. In the previous part, we created 2 players in split screen, and in this part, we're going to be adding a score handler so that way we can keep track of the combined score of the players, and we'll also be adjusting some of the scripts made in previous parts so that way we have 2 count texts to display the individual score of each player. As you're watching, if you find this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. So we're going to go ahead and start off with our canvas and adding those text scores to that canvas. So if I go over to game, you can see our old count text here in the corner, and we're just going to copy paste it and move it to where there's one in the right corner as well. So if we go over to canvas and drop it down, we can see our count text here, and I'm just going to copy paste that and then switch its side. And as you can see, it was at 10 here, and then it has a width of 200. So I'm just going to do about -210, so that way it's in this corner instead. And then I'm also going to create an empty inside the canvas, and I'm going to call this count panel. And I'm just doing this so that way I can have the 2 count texts be a child of this count panel. I'm also going to expand this count panel to be the whole width of the screen. And then now I'll go ahead and drag them in as children. And so now if you wanted to disable the count text, you could simply disable this empty, and it would get rid of both instead of having to individually go and disable both. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and create that C# script. And then we're going to name it score handler. And then I'll go ahead and open this up. This is just going to be used to hold the combined score of the 2 players. So what we're going to do is create a variable for that, and it's going to be private, and we're going to call it score. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0 by default, as we'll start off with a score of 0. And then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the start and update because we won't need that. So currently score is only accessible inside of score handler. It's a private variable, but if you want to access this from another script, then you would either need it to be public, or you can create a property for it so you can get and set its value that way. So we're going to do that, and I'm going to make it public, int, and then score with a capital S, and then we're going to do its get and set. So for get, what you're going to do is simply return our score. And then for set, what we're going to do is take our score and we're going to make it equal to the value that's provided to it. So you just do value. And so now if you wanted to access this from another script, you would need a reference to a score handler, and then you could just do score handler.score. And that's all we're doing inside our score handler. So now we're going to go ahead and go over to our menu controller, and we're going to adjust some things in here so that way we can take into account that we have 2 count texts instead of just 1. And so what we're going to do is create references for those text counts. So we're going to do public. These are going to be text mesh pro u GUIs, and then we're going to make it an array so that way we can have multiple. And then we're going to do count text. And then I'm going to create a function that we'll be able to call inside of our player controller, so that way we can change the text value of these count text objects. So I'm just going to add it to the bottom, and it's going to be public void add count text. And then this is going to take in 2 arguments, so whenever you call this function, you're going to need to supply it with 2 values of these types, and in this case, both of these types are going to be ints. So the first one is going to be our player index, and we're going to use this to say which count text we're changing. And then the second one is also going to be an integer, and it's going to be our count, and this is going to be the value that we're changing the count text to. So all we need to do is take that count text array, and then we're going to get the player index of that. So in this case, we have 2 players, so we're going to have an index of 0 being the first player, or an index of 1 being the second player. And so we'll tie the count text at index 0 to the first player, and the one at index 1 to the second player. And we want the text property of this object, so we do .text, and then we're going to set it to count, And then we're going to add to it the count that is passed, and since that's an int, we need to do toString. And so again, what we're doing in this script is adding a public reference for a text mesh pro GUI array, and we're calling this count text. And what we're going to end up putting in here is the two text objects in our scene for our count texts for the two individual players. And then our function is going to be called inside of our player controller. And inside that, we'll supply it with which player index is calling on the function, so that way it knows which text count to update. And then we'll give it the new value, which will be that count integer that's passed in. So each player will still be keeping track of their own individual score. We'll use the score handler to keep track of the combined score, and then we're going to use the menu controller to display those individual scores. So now we can go ahead and go over to our player controller. And what we want to do is add a new variable to this as well. So this is going to be public, this is going to be an int, and this is going to be our player index. We're going to end up assigning this inside of our initial spawn script that we made in the previous video, so that way we can say which player is the index of 0 and which player is the index of 1. And then what we're also going to do is actually change these from public to private, so I'm just going to copy those and then paste them down here, just because I like to keep my private variables and my public variables separate. And then I'm just going to change all of these to private. And what this does is makes it to where we no longer are assigning it through the inspector. And the reason we're doing that is because we're instantiating these objects into the scene, and so it has no knowledge of what's in the scene before we instantiate it, so we're no longer dragging those things into those public references like we did in the beginning of this tutorial. And I'm actually going to get rid of this text count as we no longer need it, because that will be handled in the menu controller. And then I'm going to add a private score handler, and I'm just going to call it score handler. And we'll be using this so that we can add to its score property to keep track of the combined scores of our two players. And now what we want to do is go ahead and assign values to all of these variables, so we're going to do that inside of start. And I'll go ahead and start with our respawn point. So we're going to do respawn point equals, and then we're going to use a game object function that Unity supplies called find. And we're going to use this so that we can find the object in the scene that is our respawn point. So I'm going to go ahead and do GameObject.find. And then the argument that it's looking for is the string name of the game object that you're searching for. And then in my case, this is going to be respawn point. You want to make sure that this string is identical to the name in the scene of the object you're wanting to reference, caps and all. And then we want the transform of this object, as we're using that transform to say at which location in the scene we want our player to respawn. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for our menu controller. So I'm going to do menu controller equals GameObject.find. And I've attached this to my canvas. If you've attached it to something else, make sure you put the name of the game object that your menu controller is attached to here. And then what we want to do is get component. And we're getting the component of menu controller. And then finally, we have our score handler, which we haven't attached yet, but I'm going to end up attaching this to the count panel we just made. So for that, score handler equals GameObject.find. And then if you're doing a game object that is a child of something, you want to make sure to include the parent as well. So in the count panel's case, that's going to be canvas. And then you're going to do a / and then count panel. And then from this object, we want its score handler, so we're going to do get component. And then in this case, it is a score handler. And now we've switched all of those references that were previously public and assigned in the inspector to be private and now assigned in our script. So now we can go ahead and adjust our previous score handling, which was done in this script. So now we no longer have this count text, so we can go ahead and get rid of this. And where this is now is inside our menu controller. So we'll go ahead and do menu controller. And then the function that we added this to is add count text. And then we need our 2 arguments. So this is going to be player index. And then we're going to pass in our count. And then as you can see here, we had a check for if it was over 12, but as one player probably isn't going to collect every single cube in the scene, we now want to see when the 2 combined players are over 12, and so that's why we added our score handler. And so we can go ahead and do score handler dot score. And so now whenever that's over 12, we know that the players have won the game. And then the final thing we're going to do in this script is add to our onTrigger enter. So we're already adding the individual count, but we also need to be adding to the combined count inside the score handler. So we're going to do score handler dot score. And as you can see on this line from the Unity tutorial, they had you do count equals count plus 1, but a shorter way to do that is simply do score handler dot score plus equals 1. And all this is saying is take my score handler, make it equal to score handler plus 1. And now finally we can go over to our initial spawn script and assign those player indexes. So we're just going to do this at the bottom. So player1 dot get component player controller. And then on this player controller we want to get our player index, and we're going to set the first one to 0. And then I'm just going to copy paste this and set players2 index to 1. And that is all of the scripting we'll be doing in this tutorial, so we can go ahead and go back to the scene. And after these scripts compile, then we want to make sure to attach our score handler. And inside of my script, I'm making reference to it on the count panel, so I want to make sure I have it actually attached to this. So we're just going to do add component, score handler. And then we also need to add our count text references to our menu controller, which is attached to our canvas. And so now we can go ahead and go down to this count text, and we're going to adjust this array size to 2. And then we can go ahead and give the first index that original count text, and the second index the count text 1. And now we can go ahead and save and test and play. And I'm getting an error about an audio listener, so we'll go ahead and look at that. So this is an issue from the previous video that I need to fix. We're going to copy paste this parent get child get component camera, because right now we're looking for an audio listener attached to the player, when in fact that audio listener is attached to the camera and not the player. So we'll go ahead and paste that. And then we'll go back to the scene and let that compile, and that should fix the error, and then both texts should work. So now we'll test and play. And that error is gone, and count 0 is displayed in both places. So now if I go over and start collecting with player 1, you can see player 1's text counting up. And if I start moving player 2 and collecting with them, their count text goes up. And then once they hit 12 together, the you win screen appears. So as a recap, we added a score handler for keeping track of the combined score, and we also adjusted existing functionality so that we could have the 2 scores displayed. As always, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can join our Discord and ask them there. We make videos here every Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, but we also stream games on Twitch Tuesday and Friday. We have a game on the Google Play Store called Blast Off, and we have an asset pack of kids' toys on the Unity store. We also have a Patreon with a YouTuber supporter tier, so if any of those things interest you, or you would like to support us in any of those ways, all of those things will be linked in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.